that ensued after October 1917 is a well-established fact. In his intellectual history of Soviet Jewish culture during the interwar period, Kenneth B. Moss, for example, describes how Jewish cultural producers' ideas about their own identity and the meaning of emancipation evolved in the years following the events of October. He also offers important new insight into how some writers and visual artists imagined their works might contribute to the development of the new liberated cosmopolitan society. To date, however, no scholar has examined the history of those Jewish artists who held prominent positions within early Soviet cultural institutions. Many questions remain about how these artists' understanding of both Jewish identity and the meaning of socialist culture may have influenced the development of Bolshevik policies on art and culture. Today I will speak about the life and work of two such artists, David Sternberg and Solomon Nikritin. And here I give you David Petrovich Sternberg, photograph from the early 1930s taken by his brother, the Soviet Jewish photographer Abraham Sternberg, and a press photograph. He's a little bit more difficult to find images of Solomon Borisovich Nikritin. Relying on archival documents, articles from the early Soviet press, memoirs, and the artist's visual works, I will begin to describe how Sternberg and Nikritin's ideas about the relationship between Jewish culture and socialist culture influenced official ideas about the meaning of socialist art within the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment, or Narkomprois, as well as within the realms of theater and museology. David Petrovich Sternberg was born in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, Russian Empire, in 1881. He applied to study at the Imperial Academy of the Arts in St. Petersburg in 1895, but was refused admission. During the anti-government insurrections of 1905, he became an active member of the Jewish Labor Bund in Odessa. And I don't have any images from that, but I did find this excellent image of a Bund election poster from later, from 1918, from Kiev. I just think it's just to give you an idea that there were artists participating in the Bund as early as 1905, and they continued to participate later on. Okay. Like many other Russian Jews, Sternberg had become fed up with a lifetime of restricted access to economic and educational opportunities, as well as with the constant threat of both organized and spontaneous anti-Semitic violence. He viewed the Bund's socialist strategies as a pathway to emancipation. As Henry J. Tobias has written, Bundists like Sternberg, quote, stood somewhere between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. In their revolutionary spirit and readiness for action, and in their faith and organization, they stood closer to the Bolsheviks than the Mensheviks. But they moved to the other side of the scale in their emphasis on the spontaneous action of the masses, the Menshevik dream, unquote. The Bundist emphasis on the spontaneous action of the masses became very important for Sternberg as he considered art's relationship to the development of a self-sustaining, emancipated collective society. In 1906, Sternberg left Odessa for Paris, where he remained with his wife and young daughter until 1917. His rejection from the Imperial Academy had not dampened his artistic ambitions, nor had the suppression of the 1905 insurrections diminished his interest in socialism. Although Sternberg experimented with Cubist abstraction during his Parisian period, he devoted most of his time and attention to figurative realist paintings. Paintings such as Worker by a Stove, it's this, and At the Port, this one, reveal that he was particularly interested in using some of the techniques of modernist painting to document the everyday life of the French working class. Sternberg did not make a name for himself in Paris with these works, but he did attract the attention of a far-left Russian art critic. In 1914, that critic, Anatoly Lunacharsky, published a series of articles under the heading Young Russia in Paris for the newspaper Kievskaya Mysl, or Kiev Thought, in which he focused on the work of Russian Jewish artists. In his review of Sternberg's work, Lunacharsky praised the way in which the artist revealed the exact construction of the objects and individuals represented in his paintings through his particular handling of color. The critic concluded that Sternberg's methods had the potential to extend beyond the visual and cognitive constraints of the canvas to affect the viewer emotionally, just as the rhythmic sounds of poetry might affect him or her. All the signs are here, Lunacharsky wrote, that this is not only a painter, but also a poet. Where that poet will go, we shall see. Lunacharsky's early interest in the poetry of Sterenberg's paintings had a major impact on both the artist's career and the earlier Soviet understanding of the meaning of socialist art. When the artist heard the news of the February Revolution in 1917, he started to plan his way back to Russia with the hope that the time for socialism had finally come. When the artist did arrive in Petrograd, the October Revolution had already taken place. The Bolsheviks were now in control of the government, and Lunacharsky had been appointed to the people's first commissar of enlightenment, or kompros. Drawing upon the theory of proletarian culture that he had formulated together with his friend and colleague, Alexander Bogdanov, Lunacharsky declared that the proletarian artist would play a key role in the development of the new society. He also explained that poetry, in both its visual and verbal forms, would function as the most important form of proletarian art because of its ability to convey both the bliss and difficulty of the antagonistic struggle that he argued defined collectivity. When the time came for Lunacharsky to appoint the leaders of the subsections of Narkompros, he selected Sterenberg as the head of the fine arts, or EZO section. And here they are. So that's Sterenberg in the hat, Lunacharsky in the middle, and obviously Lenin there on the far right. He made this decision not only because of the artist's left-wing politics, as Sheila Fitzpatrick has argued, but also because he thought that Sterenberg's paintings exuded the kind of visual poetry that he imagined would arouse the proletariat. Since the artist was relatively unknown in Russia and had not been an active member of the pre-revolutionary futurist avant-garde, his appointment surprised the other members of the visual arts community. Well-known artists such as Kazimir Malevich, Vladimir Tatlin, and Nadezhda Udaltsova quickly understood that as the head of EZO Narkompros, Sterenberg would now have the power to determine not just who received government commissions for art projects, he would also be in an excellent position to help determine the very definition of Soviet art. Indeed, Sterenberg did use his new position to try to implement his own theory of proletarian art, which combined ideas about modernist painting that he had begun to develop in Paris with Bundist ideas about the significance of the spontaneous action of the masses and his own interpretation of Jewish cultural traditions. The artist first expressed his position in a 1919 letter to the critics of Prolet Kult, which appeared in the EZO Narkompros funded newspaper Art of the Commune, or Искусство коммуны. Prolet Kult served as an acronym for the Proletarian Cultural Enlightenment Organizations. Alexander Bogdanov, Lunacharsky's friend and colleague, acted as the organization's head. Bogdanov criticized modernist art, and Prolet Kult as a whole advocated the processes of industrial production as the means best suited to the task of building a collective proletarian culture. In his letter to Prolet Kult, Sterenberg accused the organization of, quote, pouring new wine into old holy wineskins, unquote. He argued that in their enthusiasm for industrial standardization and systemization, Prolet Kult risked implementing a system that would do nothing but re-render the worker a faceless cog in a socio-economic apparatus that would be indistinguishable from that of modern capitalism. In contrast to Prolet Kult, under Sterenberg's leadership, EZO Narkompros extended the majority of its financial support to modernist painters. The organization also trained workers in the techniques of the mounted, or in Russian, stankovoya, arts, such as painting and sculpture. And if we, Sterenberg wrote, in defense of EZO Narkompros's activities, a group of young artists have created schools in which every proletarian can acquire technical skill and reveal his face, then we have the right to say that we have done something for the revolution. In the next passage of his letter, Sterenberg described futurism as the form of artistic production that would allow the worker to reveal his face. He wrote, "Futurism is the search for new pathways. We are searching continuously, and we are calling the proletarian masses to search together with us, and to not believe anyone, not us and not you. Least of all you, because you have already declared yourselves," speaking of Prolet Kult, "the monopolists of proletarian culture. Self-creation, that is the path to proletarian construction. And therefore, long live the workers' proletkult, but down with the pompous proletkultists. Although Sternberg uses the term futurism, his text is not a call for a return to the forms of Zaumist poetry and painting that characterized the pre-revolutionary Russian avant-garde. Here he has appropriated their term in order to emphasize that the forms of art that Izo supported, mainly modernist painting, constitute the art of the future, the art of the proletarian collective. Sternberg's own paintings from this immediate post-revolutionary period offer additional insight into how he imagined modernist visual objects would contribute to the development of a new collective society. During his time in Paris, as the artist produced figurative realist images of working class life, just to remind you, they look like these. And before I say anything else about these, I want to point out that he has this theory about the importance of the members of the proletariat being able to reveal their faces. And if you look carefully at this painting of the workers in the port, you'll see that none of them have any kind of facial features whatsoever. And what he's getting at here is, in a painting like this, is when someone is working under these capitalist working conditions, as he interprets them, they're not allowed, the worker is simply a cog in the system of labor. He or she is not allowed to become a full subject with agency. And that's what's of interest to him in trying to create some kind of art that would allow those who produce it and interact with it to become agents within this broad socialist collective. Okay. So he produced figurative realist paintings of working class life in order to expose the impoverishing and disempowering effects of the French capitalist economy. In Russia during war communism, however, the means of capitalist production were, at least in theory, in the process of either being seized or destroyed. From Sternberg's perspective, this had created the necessary social and economic circumstances for the formal techniques of modernist art with which artists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque had been experimenting in Paris, and which the futurists had tried to mobilize as a means of revolt in pre-revolutionary Russia, to finally function as a means of social and political reform. Drawing on modernist techniques, Sternberg produced a series of relentlessly flat, disorienting still life paintings, which he hoped would encourage the Soviet artist spectator to reveal her face, and in so doing, help catalyze the spontaneous action of the proletarian masses. Both of the examples from Sternberg's still life series, Still Life with Candy and Sponge and Soap, are representations of scarce but desirable everyday objects. During the period of war communism, when these paintings were produced, the rationing of food and all types of manufactured goods was severe. Soap and chocolate would have been luxury items that few could even dream of consuming. In his 1927 article, Painting, the art critic Yakov Tulginhol wrote that in his paintings from 1918 to 1919, Sternberg rendered these rare yet desirable objects, quote, with a kind of devotional love that existed only among people during the years of starvation, when such things became the subject of lust and dreams. Here the technicism of form already begins to blend with their psychological content, unquote. It is my argument that Sternberg was aware of the public's desire for such objects and used this to lure them to the canvas. The paintings would become, for the Soviet artist spectator, a kind of common visual text around which a community of men, or women, humans, could potentially form. That is to say, Sternberg imagined that modernist paintings, like his own, would function much in the same way that a religious text functions during the performance of Jewish cultural rituals. During Passover, for example, when the story of Exodus is discussed, everyone is encouraged to participate in the telling of the tale. Each contributor is also encouraged to ask questions, to generate debate, and to add something to the interpretation of the story. This practice brings together the members of the community around something that they share, which has both a practical, tangible component, a common meal, and an intangible component, the community's history of bondage. This ritual sharing creates a space that is generative. Each participant's utterance not only adds something new to the story of freedom, it also affords each member of the community the opportunity to be born again as a creator, at the moment when the others around the table recognize his or her contribution to the narrative. That is, it affords each member the opportunity to reveal his face in the company of his equals. Sternberg hoped that his modernist paintings, like the religious texts in Jewish cultural rituals, would provoke questions and encourage debate about aspects of everyday life shared by the proletarian masses. In each picture, Sternberg presents a single frame from an isolated everyday routine. The objects in both images have been arranged as if to imply a pause in action. The painting's laconic surfaces are at once extraordinarily tactile, which is true. If you look at the canvases, they're a remarkable mix of a variety of different textures, which he produces all through paint. There's no single element of collage. And they're also relentlessly flat. Sternberg reasoned that since oil paint and canvas are composed on the molecular level of the same material objects as the elements of everyday life, they could somehow be exploited to examine how both sight and touch work together to contribute to the perception of the material world. In Still Life with Candy, for example, he experiments with the inherent pliability of the canvas in combination with the tactile qualities of the pigment to create a relief that pushes the yellow wrappers of the as-yet untouched candy outward into the viewer's space of apprehension, as if to remind her that it is not only the way the candy looks, but the way it feels that makes her want to unwrap and eat it. Sternberg considered the space of the painting's display as important as the content of the surface of the canvas. Once on view, the artist imagined that the canvas would function as a planar common table around which the socialist public could gather. As an entity set apart from the potentially destructive systematicity of industrial production, the table plane would, he hoped, establish a space for the development and maintenance of a collective. By providing a surface that encouraged the viewer to consider how her particular understanding and experience of the material objects contributes to her understanding of the spaces of their existence, Sternberg's modernist still life paintings were designed to function as catalysts to spontaneous expression. Not only would they encourage the viewer to join in the search for new pathways, but within the discussional spaces of public display, they would also allow her to enunciate and render her particular interpretation of those pathways. The paintings ask the viewer to reveal her face, to be recognized as a creator of the new material world by her fellow creators. Further, the pictures ask the public to consider how their relationship to common objects and common desires connect them to one another. Sternberg, however, places no bets on what shape or direction the collective, as it forms within the spaces of display, will eventually take. He leaves that to be determined by the spontaneous action of the masses. And so just to conclude, to answer potential questions about where these strange still life paintings led him and what, most importantly, what was their legacy on Soviet arts policy? The most important thing to understand is, whatever you think of Sternberg's argument and his understanding of a painting as a catalyst to collective formation, what they did do was they created a very important space for painting to stay in the discussion about the future of Soviet art. So I'm making the argument that it's because of Sternberg in this position as the head of ISO Narkomproas, making this, however strange, case for the function of painting, that he played a significant role in establishing painting as one of the key forms of socialist art, from which we know we see develop things like socialist realism eventually, right? Because at this moment, 1919, 1920, there's quite a lot of competition between ISO Narkomproas and Prolet Kult. And when he's writing this letter, for example, to the critics of Prolet Kult, it is actually looking like Prolet Kult and eventually the constructivist artists will win out. These will become these kind of new methods of industrial production, industrial art, are going to become the kind of standard form of socialist art. Painting, sculpture, and the other mounted arts will disappear. So for him making this argument, what he does do is he makes sure that painting stays a key part of visual culture. That's really important. The second thing is that I promised that I would say one thing also a little bit about Solomon Nikritin, and I will conclude with that. I also want to say that in order to address the question, whether or not I mean, my interpretation of Sternberg's recourse to Jewish culture, I'm getting from my knowledge of his biography and also my reading of the paintings. But it is also important to recognize he did join the Kulturliga, which was an organization, I'm sure as many of you know, devoted to finding ways to integrate Jewish culture into this new socialist society and indeed into some of its policies. He was a member of this organization. He participated in this exhibition. You can see his name on the poster that Natan Altman, one of his friends and colleagues, drew. He participated in Moscow with Altman and with Marc Chagall. So he's clearly interested very much in some way integrating aspects of Jewish culture into Soviet life. The other thing that's, I think, really important to understand is that when critics looked at these still life paintings, the first thing that many of them said was they pointed out aspects, Jewish critics as well, saying these are Jewish paintings. Sternberg is too much of a Jewish humanist. This was one of the things that he was criticized for. He's not enough of a socialist, Bolshevik socialist. So those are all things that were part of the history of these works. In addition to making sure that a space for painting was maintained within Soviet cultural institutions, he did directly influence artists like Solomon Nikritin. I won't go through and discuss in detail, unfortunately, his paintings because I don't really have the time, but important distinction in that he's similar to Sternberg in that he was also a member of the Kulturliga. He was someone who was also interested in integrating Jewish culture into socialist collective life and using aspects of it to kind of fuel the transformation of the new society. Unlike Sternberg, however, he is a little bit more interested in some of the techniques of Proletarian Collective. He actually participated in some of their work. He made paintings like this monument, and it's very strange with the bass at the top and the man at the bottom and the gradations of color. He was very interested in the relationship between sound and color and thinking about industrial production as something that could potentially be very useful. So whereas Sternberg doesn't want anything to do with it, Nikritin's very interested in it, but he also agrees with Sternberg about the need for the maintenance of painting and its spaces. And to get back to the issue of policy, this becomes very important, maybe not in Izo Narkomproas, but Solomon Nikritin becomes the leader or the head director of the Polytechnical Museum. So one of my further questions for ongoing research with this project is to look at his leadership, the period of his leadership at the Polytechnical Museum, to look at his works and to think about how his experiences, his understanding of Jewish culture and its relationship to the revolution, as well as his understanding of the role of painting and visual culture may have influenced his direction of the Polytechnical Museum and then Soviet museology thereon. Okay, thank you.
Итак, значит, мы его отдельно все, да? Сейчас вопрос, пожалуйста.
I'm wondering about the argument you made about the representation of the individual under capitalist society and the way that this was, in some sense, rejected in the period of war communism. I'm wondering, how did the art change after the introduction of the new economic policy? How did he deal with the sort of figure of the proletariat under the conditions of the return to wage labor, et cetera?
Am I answer now or answer now? Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So the thing with Sternberg is that he's unbelievably stubborn. So he's very sure. This is one thing about him. He's very sure that his idea of modernist painting is the path to socialism. So for most of the new economic policy, he does not budge from these types of paintings, these really strange, flat, still life paintings of everyday objects. He is, however, put under a lot of pressure because in his early advocacy of painting, he also inadvertently makes way for the kind of resurgence of realist painting, right? And so people like the Association of Artists of Revolutionary Russia, these kinds of strict realist painting organizations, they kind of enjoy a renaissance in that many, many people went to see their works. And so other policymakers started to say, hey, realist painting, figurative realist painting is very popular among the Soviet masses. Maybe that's what we need. So Sternberg around 1926, there's a big push, including from the leftist intelligentsia, for artists to start returning to figurative realist paintings. And it is only at that moment in 26 that he actually starts making. He goes back to making figurative paintings, but they're not like his figurative realist paintings from his Parisian period. They also have a strange, laconic quality to them as well. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Thank you very much. To get back to what you were commenting on at the end about the Jewish, the Jewish theme, because he's put at the head of this organization, do we see a sort of promotion of perhaps other Bundes artists? I'm not familiar with that particular group, but is it? I mean, do we see an ethnic? An ethno-national whatever policy there at all, or is it more really about perhaps you can comment a little bit more on what's kind of quote unquote, I hate to say it this way, but in a cliche way, what's Jewish about it?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a really great question as well, and it's a completely reasonable question. I will say, though, for all of his personal interest in kind of Jewish culture and its relationship to the revolution, as he's head of Izo Narkomproas, he doesn't necessarily favor Jewish artists. He favors modernist painters. He favors people who paint like him. So if they're Jewish, great. If they're not, it kind of doesn't matter. So like he for example, I mentioned Nadezhda Udaltsova, and I mentioned her very specifically because she had been quite famous. During the period where Sternberg is trying to make his way back to the USSR, she'd actually established herself as a really well-known professor of art at the art school of Hutemas. I mean, by all rights, she should have been the person that had been appointed to Izo and Narkomproas, right? But she wasn't, for the reasons I outlined. But he came to support her painting. She's not Jewish, and he came to support her work. So I think that he's really, really committed to this idea of modernist painting as the path to the future, and he's willing to support it almost at all costs. And I should add too, with respect to the new economic policy period, that there was a small contingent that came to support him of younger artists. So I don't know if maybe people have heard of the group, the Society of Easel Painters. Alexander Deineka was a member of that. Yuri Pimenov, very well-known artists, sort of said, yeah, Sternberg is right. We need the easel painting. That's something we need. And they actually appointed him as the leader of their group without him actually being, asked. I mean, he didn't say, I'm starting this group. They came to him and asked him, so.
Does it mean that his membership at the Kulturliga was really notional?
Yeah.
I have maybe a little provocative question.
Uh-huh.
How much about him was really Jewish? To what extent what we see, the ideas that he developed? I mean, yes, there is here the Kulturliga, but to what extent what the ideas he develops are really influenced? I mean, he's Jewish, he was at one point a Bundist, but does it still play a role at the time when he shapes these ideas? Which is the premise of your talk.
Yeah.
This is why I said it's provocative.
I think it does. I mean, I don't think he's certainly not a religious Jew, right? I mean, that's the first thing to say.
I don't mean it in any way.
Right, but I think I should say that though, because I think that's important to be clear. Like he is a socialist, so he is not observant in any kind of religious way, right? But I think that if we look at a lot of Soviet Jewish artists, this is the question you're asking. I mean, the answer to that is always going to be complicated. I mean, there's Sternberg, there's Nathan Altman, there's Chagall, there's Lisitsky. They're all Jewish, but to what extent each of them is Jewish, we're going to have to look at them one by one to be able to determine that. I mean, my argument is that, and the argument certainly of some of the critics in the early 1920s, is that the way in which Sternberg is trying to think of socialist art objects and its role in the new society is rooted in ideas of Jewish humanism and Jewish culture. And that's probably the extent to which I would say that he's Jewish.